Moscow. The Kremlin has escalated its rhetoric against European leaders over ongoing discussions about using frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine's war-torn economy. At the heart of the dispute is the fate of nearly 300 billion euros in Russian state assets that have been frozen across various jurisdictions since the invasion of Ukraine began. The debate has intensified in recent weeks as European Union policymakers and their allies weigh proposals to channel those funds toward rebuilding Ukraine and replenishing its defence needs. The Kremlin, long wary of any such moves, issued its strongest warning yet. Officials in Moscow framed the proposal as a flagrant breach of international law and property rights, warning that any attempt to seize the funds would have far-reaching consequences not only for Russia, but also for the global financial system. A senior Kremlin spokesman delivered the stark message in Moscow on Tuesday, accusing Western governments of overstepping legal and ethical boundaries. The spokesman said, "We have already responded to these processes repeatedly at various levels. We are talking about plans to illegally confiscate Russian property. In Russian, we call that simply theft. If someone wants to steal our property, our assets, misappropriate them and profit from these assets, then, of course, first of all, those involved will be prosecuted in one way or another. They will all be held accountable, not only these individuals, but also the countries that make the relevant decisions. Of course, this cannot go unanswered." The choice of words describing Western intentions as theft underscored the depth of Russian anger and set the tone for a confrontation that could ripple far beyond the battlefield in Ukraine. The Kremlin official went on to argue that the repercussions of such a move would not be limited to Russia's losses. He said, and secondly, these are additional steps toward completely destroying trust in the principle of property and viability. So in this case, the boomerang will seriously impact those who are the main depositories, countries interested in investment attractiveness, and so on and so forth. This pointed remark was aimed squarely at Europe's financial centres, countries like Germany, France and Belgium, which have long promoted themselves as stable havens for global capital. Moscow's warning implied that by violating the sanctity of sovereign and private property, those same countries risk undermining investor confidence in their own markets. The frozen assets, accumulated over years through Russian state investments and the holdings of its central bank, have been a tempting resource for Ukraine's allies as they struggle to sustain the flow of financial and military aid to Kyiv. EU officials say the annual interest accrued on these frozen funds alone could provide billions of euros in steady support for Ukraine, especially as donor fatigue grows in Washington and European capitals. However, while the idea of redirecting the funds to Ukraine has gained momentum in some quarters, particularly in Eastern Europe and among Baltic states, it has faced resistance from other member states and international legal experts. They warn that outright confiscation, as opposed to using only the interest on the frozen assets, could set a dangerous precedent. Critics argue that it would blur the line between sanctions and expropriation, potentially triggering retaliatory measures by other countries and complicating future diplomatic negotiations. Moscow's threat to pursue legal measures against countries that move ahead with asset confiscation reflects a broader strategy, portraying itself as a defender of international norms even as it remains isolated over its invasion of Ukraine. Russian officials have repeatedly claimed that their property is protected under international law and that any attempt to divert it would be contested in courts around the world. The Kremlin's spokesman emphasized that such actions would not only invite lawsuits, but would also erode what remains of the fragile trust between Russia and the West. He said, with billions at stake, the outcome could have long-lasting implications not only for Ukraine and Russia, but also for the stability of Europe's financial markets. This warning echoed growing concerns among some Western economists and policymakers who fear that confiscating Russia's frozen assets might trigger capital flight from European banks, particularly among investors from countries outside the West, who may start questioning the security of their holdings. The dispute over the frozen assets is increasingly viewed as part of a broader economic struggle between Russia and its Western adversaries. Since the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Moscow has been subjected to sweeping sanctions targeting its energy exports, financial institutions, and key industrial sectors. While these measures have squeezed parts of the Russian economy, they have not forced the Kremlin to back down in Ukraine. Instead, Russia has sought to redirect trade to Asia and the global south, cultivating alternative markets for its oil, gas, and other commodities. For European countries, meanwhile, the use of frozen Russian assets represents a potential new front in the economic war, one that could provide Ukraine with much-needed funding while simultaneously punishing Moscow. But the political and legal costs of such a move remain uncertain. The Kremlin's argument about the boomerang effect resonates with a segment of the international financial community. Bankers and investors have voiced apprehension that if major powers such as the EU and the United States show they are willing to override property rights for geopolitical ends, it could erode trust in the very institutions that underpin global finance. Some analysts warn that this could push certain countries, especially those with tense relations with the West, to move their reserves and investments out of Western financial hubs, weakening the global influence of the dollar and euro. In Moscow, officials have been keen to amplify these concerns, casting themselves as champions of a rules-based economic order that they say the West is undermining. Despite the strong rhetoric, it remains unclear how far European leaders are willing to go. So far, most discussions within the EU have centred on using only the profits generated by the frozen Russian assets rather than confiscating the principal itself. Legal experts have pointed out that seizing the principal amount would face significant legal challenges in European courts, where property rights are enshrined in both national constitutions and EU law. Nevertheless, pressure is mounting. Ukraine's government has repeatedly called for swifter and more decisive action, arguing that the funds could play a pivotal role in stabilising the country's war-battered economy and financing its reconstruction. For Moscow, the mere discussion of such plans is seen as a hostile act. Kremlin officials have accused European leaders of hypocrisy, saying they claim to uphold international law while preparing to violate it when convenient. The standoff over the frozen assets highlights a deeper and more enduring rift between Russia and the West, a clash not only over Ukraine, but over the norms that govern the global financial system. By portraying the dispute as a matter of principle rather than just a fight over money, the Kremlin seeks to rally other nations that may share concerns about the precedent such actions could set. The outcome of this confrontation may shape not just the course of the war in Ukraine, but also the future of international finance. If European leaders proceed with plans to repurpose Russia's frozen assets, they risk testing the resilience of long-standing rules and the willingness of global investors to keep faith in Western markets. As Moscow has made clear, it is prepared to contest such moves on every front: legal, diplomatic, and rhetorical. The battle over billions of euros locked in Western banks has become another front in a conflict that shows no sign of abating.